everybody. It is Mike Levin on this fine Pi Day in my third video on 3/14/2021, Sunday. And I'm just starting my drive back to Pennsylvania, leaving Staten Island. Got a hour and a half drive ahead of me, so hey, maybe you'll have an hour and a half video, but I don't think so. I think I'll get right to the point. Over the last few videos, I have been mentioning that things are not always what they seem. For example, you are actually working in object-oriented notation merely by virtue of working in a .py file, because that py file can be imported by another .py file as a module, and modules are given namespaces, and namespaces carry with them the properties and the methods, i.e. the functions and the values of everything that you wrote inside that .py file. It's just automatically kind of turned into very close parallels to classes and methods and properties, just automatically for free. So one of the things that isn't quite like it seems, object-oriented is presented as something a little less accessible than normal functions that you create with the def keyword. DEF space, you define a function. And if you were defining something to be used in object-oriented notation, you would be defining a class instead of a def. So your keyword would be class. And then there's all these conventions on top of just the normal kind of entry-level Python you need to know. You need to know how to pass around the self-reference, which is a keyword that gets used all around in object-oriented Python in order to refer to the object that IN, so that, objects, dot notation has a place to start. When you're talking about starting at an instantiated instance of the class that you're designing, you pass around self. Other languages use this. So it's a common thing. It's a little bit verbose, but there's some verbose parts of Python, and you just live with it because explicit is better than implicit. So that brings us to other things which are not exactly what they appear to be at first glance. How about the Python language itself? How about the very name Python for the language? How many people who use it have just come to accept it, but when you stop to think about it, that's an awfully harsh, linear, masculine name for such a soft, circular, feminine language. Some might take exception with me, but I would say that languages that give very little room for exception, that go the straight and narrow, that make you type all your variables and set things up for static compiling the best it can, are the actual linear, shall we call them green arrow languages, C being one of the, granddaddies and biggest examples. Then there's things that just are completely open-ended. Languages that let you build languages because of their self-referentiality, i.e. circular nature, that are very difficult to compile, but are indeed the languages you would write a compiler with. So you can bootstrap the whole process. The granddaddy on that side being Lisp. And instead of green arrow angular, it's blue and soft and fuzzy and feminine, and with much more capacity to learn and change and to be a dynamic system, and perhaps at the expense of the ability to do optimized compiles for the fastest runtime. There are these diametrically opposing forces in tech, but each has to have the other one a little bit in it to work well. So it's yin and yang for sure. The yang languages, the green arrow, linear, straight and narrows, which make a lot of use of enforced typing and syntax. The Go language would be another wonderful, great example because, these things compile and it's all about the equivalent of the quote .exe. Although it might be an ELF file, there's different things that get compiled based on the operating system and hardware involved. But nonetheless, it's something that has a lot of privileged knowledge about the hardware it's running on, so you can drop it in location in memory and it's off running in a highly compiled way. When they talk about the difference between things like the NumPy component in Python and the SQLite component in Python and other things that are native Python code, well, it's because these things are not native Python code. They're usually written in and compiled in C, and they are on your machine as distributable binary executables. All the more easy now that the Python pip install system, PyPy, the Python packaging index, supports something called Wheels, which has pre-compiled binaries for whatever hardware is your poison. So if you're on x86, you get your x86 binaries. If you're on this new fancy schmancy 64-bit ARM, well, maybe you'll get binaries. If not today, then probably in a few months. But you get compiled binaries for the, hardware abstraction platform you're on. And that has updated pip to be quite a bit more robust and able to install NumPy without also putting the whole, what they would call the tool chain, the GCC, the GNU compiler tool chain on your machine so that you could compile from source. You don't need that. There used to be a lot of that in the Linux world, and much less so these days. And the general Linux installers are trying to go that route too, going from apt-get install based on the Debian package manager system to things even more binary oriented called like Snap. I think Snap is the one Ubuntu is trying to compel people into. And we are in the era of seeing it settle out. We've seen other things settle out, like Systemd, the daemon manager, and the system manager, and all these other things, the scheduler, the clone replacement. Systemd it won, except on a few platforms like Gentoo and Arch Linux. But now the replacement for RPM and Debian package manager that most people know as the apt system, there's competitors for that because the same binary pre-compiled for your platform binary system that we saw happen in pip install is happening now on the more generic Linux installers, and they're finding their, I guess Linux version independent solutions. I'm not sure what they're going for independent from each other now. It's really interesting watching these things duke it out. The GNOME desktop only recently won because the canonical version of Linux, Ubuntu, which used to forge their own way with their own desktop operating system, which wasn't bad, called Unity. It was actually pretty nice, but it lost. And so now the GNOME desktop has won, and now GNOME has a lot of pressure on it to mature and to look good, because it looked kind of amateurish for many years, and Unity looked better. But now I think GNOME looks pretty good. And, if you're dissatisfied, you can use Mint. And Mint can be used with different backends other than Ubuntu. It's like, or Debian. They're like, Mint, that's just a skinning on Ubuntu. Well, not necessarily. You can have Mint running as the front end, I do believe, for FreeBSD, actual Unix. So you can mix and match these things in all kinds of ways, and you've got to know what platform you target. So we're targeting System D on Linux. There's some religion in here. There's platforms other than Linux. But if you can get it running on Linux, you can get it running in this world for the next 5 to 20 years. So Linux plus Python plus Vim. Interestingly enough, I still choose Vim and choose not to put my muscle memory, my technical chops in the hands of a Microsoft implementation of a text editor. Once again, Microsoft owns your soul by a handle you provide them. You've popped out to the right with VS Code, own your sol as muscle memory dependency. Everything you do, including how to access a remote server, will be through VS Code and specialized extensions it installs so it can do SSH and make you feel like you're using desktop windowing software. You know, hello, if you just learn to use an SSH, a shell, a Unix terminal over SSH connections, you can just do anything, and you understand the underpinnings of all the deployment systems too. So it's hard to pull the wool over your eyes if you can SSH into a webhead and Vim a file in a pinch. It's a good skill to have, and it could be your primary development platform in a pinch. So things are not always what they seem. VS Code is not what it seems. Object-oriented programming is not what it seems. You're doing it on Python whether you know it or not. The very language of Python was named after the comedy troupe of England. The silly folks who talk about dead parrots and sing about spam. I highly recommend catching up on their movies and their TV programs, Monty Python's Flying Circus. And the Python programming language was programmed, that was named after a comedy troupe, a tongue-in-cheek reference to a comedy troupe doing what I've come to refer to as the original switching of alpha and beta. You know, you've got your alphas out there in the world, you've got your betas out there in the world, and then you've got your secret string pullers, invisible hand folks, who are your betas, who no one's ever heard about. They're not the rock stars. They're the ones who are really, pulling the strings because they control the money purses, right? No, it's not wacky conspiracy stuff. Those who invest money in things and can apply pressure on corporations to behave in certain ways are in charge because, the corporations put pressure on society to behave certain ways through marketing and advertising and media, and certain types of consumption is done because of certain expectations that are created. And back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, that was General Electric and Westinghouse by owning NBC and CBS. ABC has managed to remain, I think, independent up until the time it was bought by Disney, but then it was media buying media, not really so much the military-industrial complex, such as it were. So, where does that leave us? That leaves us in the current times where CBS and NBC have been replaced by Amazon and Google and Apple. So Apple remains the independent because they don't need their money through advertising the way Google does. Google makes their money by people paying money to get in your path when you search or through your various behaviors, right? So amazingly, things like Google Docs remains free, and they're not making you look at ads to do it. That's because they make so much money when you look at ads for Google search. So much the same as what existed in the post-World War II economy, where masked pop culture expectations was set through basically 3 channels that broadcast on the VHF broadcasting bandwidth, and a couple of fuzzy channels that were available on UHF that only the kids watched in after-school kids programming. And so it was pretty easy to align people's beliefs and to bring about breakfast cereals and husband going off to work, and the father knows best, leave it to Beaver kind of era, very patriarchy, very patriarchy. And the internet changed that. Cable TV was the precursor, and today things are so fragmented that only a handful of social events like the Super Bowl and presidential inaugurations captures the country's, much less the world's, attention in a unified fashion. Breaking news events, that's why the news cycle plays such a weird and insidious role in what it does. I wish there was a pause on